Thank you all for being here at this Zoom version of the oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles. Been in business since 1940, and we try several times a week to have these very timely discussions. This is about as timely as a discussion as we can have for political reasons, cultural reasons, and reasons of American law. And we have with us two spectacularly interesting and accomplished people. Let me start by introducing John Powers, who will be our interlocutor this evening. John is a well-known culture critic. If you listen to Fresh Air, you've certainly heard John's point of view. He wrote extensively and importantly for LA Weekly. He's been published widely. He's recovering from a time as a professor at Georgetown University and is living out in Pasadena near Vroman's Books, which I hope everybody will be patronizing as well. And the author tonight is Jon Wiener, who's a friend of mine and has written one of the two most important books that I've read this summer. In the surreptitious sales portion of this, you'll see over my shoulder John's incredibly important book, Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s, which he wrote with Mike Davis. And it is a perfect companion to the book that we'll be speaking about tonight, Conspiracy in the Streets. Let me just talk a moment about the Chicago 7 or Chicago 8 trial as by way of introduction. I am, to put biases on the table, a former federal prosecutor, married to a former federal prosecutor who travels in a circle of former federal prosecutors. And like most lawyers of our vintage, when asked, why did you become a lawyer? We have two reference points. The first, of course, is To Kill a Mockingbird. And the second is the Chicago 7 trial. One is something that we always hoped we would be, and the other presents the alternative that we knew for sure we could never, ever want to be. So having the chance now in the midst of what's going on in America, as well as on television, to read this Chicago 7 book, I thought, what could be better than having my friend John W. And his friend John P. to talk about this important book at this important time. I would like to sort of ask a foundational question that is derived from the afterword in the book written by Tom Hayden. I should say John writes a brilliant introduction, kind of an opening statement, far better than the opening statement given by either of the sides in the case. And Tom Hayden, who many of us know, in 2006 wrote an afterword, which I thought talked about the importance of this trial and projected out what a political and cultural influence it had. And one of the most striking things that he said, and I'm interested in your points of view on this, both Johns, is the statement, some of us gave up on America prematurely. And I wondered, as you read about this and viewed it through the prism of being this historian who's expert in the 1960s, whether you thought Tom Hayden got it right that some of us gave up on America prematurely. I'll back away and let you guys have at it. Thanks.
Well, the reason that we're interested in the trial now, I blush to say, is not because of this book. It's because of Aaron Sorkin's movie, The Trial of the Chicago 7, which is playing on the Netflix right now. And it's got something like 250 reviews, almost all of which are positive. And the movie does, it's an Aaron Sorkin movie. It's not a documentary. It has, it features men making eloquent arguments with each other. And two of the men who make eloquent arguments kind of one of the central conflicts and arguments of the film is between Tom Hayden, arguing in Aaron Sorkin's view for voting and trying to win over the jury and supporting democracy, and Abbey Hoffman, who is a yippie who wants to de-sanctify the courtroom and delegitimize the judge and the prosecution and bring cultural revolution. So I think in a minute we want to get to the question of, well, there have been a lot of complaints that this is unfair to Tom, that Tom was not really a liberal defender of voting in 1968 and 69 as Sorkin portrays him. But in 68 and 69, it was pretty hard to keep the faith in America. Your choice was between Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon, the party of war, or the party of Joe McCarthy and the Republicans. So there really, once Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in June of 1968 in Los Angeles, there was nobody left to vote for, and originally they thought that tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 people would come to Chicago to protest because they had lost faith in America. In fact, only about 10,000 people showed up for these demonstrations. But Tom himself had a lot of those doubts in 1968 and 1969.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the way he's filmed is the way he talks. Sorkin, who it's worth pointing out that he knew nothing about the trial. He was partly because he's too young and partly because he wasn't interested. So that in fact, he's just reading about it, whereas people who are old enough actually remember the trial vividly. But he knew nothing about it, so it was much easier probably for him to shape it toward his own ends. But Hayden sounds a bit like Bill Clinton. When Bill Clinton wrote the thing to the draft board about political viability, in the course of the film, Hayden seems more that way than he actually seemed like Tom Hayden, who at that point in his life was certainly not a political viability guy. But I guess to deal with this issue, when Hollywood handles history, they turn it into entertainment. That's what they do, and often even when it's not Hollywood, they do their own versions of things. So I was thinking to myself, in the Quentin Tarantino version, because he does history, at the end, Abbey Hoffman shoots Judge Hoffman, and they all walk out. Okay. In the Ken Burns thing, there's sad music, and it's kind of elegiac about the tragedy of American democracy. In the Sorkin version, you get this, which is a battle between a good liberal, like Sorkin / Hayden, and then the kind of wilder guys. But Sorkin's talented enough to make the wilder guys more fun, and to make Hayden a bit of a drip in the course of a film. But it has been Sorkinized in that way. And this is partly when you're doing political films. If you don't have a clear and conscious political idea, then you often just fall into your rote way of thinking about things. And for Sorkin, that's a kind of heroic liberalism where the system will finally work because we're going to all get it together. And, Abbey and Tom Hayden may fight all through the film, but they're going to really respect one another by the time it all ends. I mean that's just pure Sorkin. If this had been made by Roberto Rossellini, say, or the Taviani brothers, there would have been a politics to the film that they were conscious of, rather than one that they were doing kind of unconsciously.
Yeah, and one of the features of Sorkinization, let's call it, is the happy resolution, and the happy ending here. In some ways, it's very effective on screen. Is that Tom is told by the judge? Those of you who've seen the movie will remember this. If you, young man, you could go far in this system, but you must show remorse. And you must speak respectfully to the court, and you must be brief. And if you do those things, he says, I will look favorably on you when it comes time to sentencing. Do you understand? And there's sort of zoom shots on everybody. Do you understand? And Tom says, yes, I understand. And we're all hoping, don't do it, don't do it. And then Tom reads the list, which is being prepared throughout the movie by Rennie Davis, of the names of Americans killed in Vietnam, Tom refuses to play the game that the judge wants him to play. He defies the injustice of the court and stands up for what he knows is right, what is true, what the whole thing has been about. And the whole courtroom erupts into applause. At home, I could hardly help from cheering myself. I'm so happy that Tom Hayden has learned to stand up to injustice. Finally, because of this trial and experiences, arguing with Abbey. Now, our friends, my friends at least, who were there or who are historians, say this is totally inaccurate. The true story is there was a list of names that was read, but it was at the beginning and not at the end. And it was read by Dave Dellinger and not by Tom. And well, so what's the big deal here? Sorkin moved something from the beginning to the end and changed the person who reads the list. That's not a terrible offense. But there was one big difference. So when Dave Dellinger read the list, it wasn't just of the American dead. It included the Vietnamese dead. John Powers, doesn't this make it kind of a difference?
Oh, it makes a huge difference. You know, I mean, because it just the motives of the people involved in the event. And you know, with the whole suggestion that the whole thing is basically about somehow Hubert Humphrey, and purely an American issue, which in fact it wasn't. You know, there's the other detail that is, you know, that is, you know, that's what's not true. We'll start with that. Is there's a scene where David Dellinger, the man who actually was a pacifist in World War II, when that was not an, you know, a conscientious objector in World War II is not an easy thing to do, and to have him punch someone purely for the irony of it, the dramatic irony of the film, isn't just doing that. It's in fact somehow questioning, and it kind of diminishes his genuine idealism and makes him more like, makes him less heroic. Because yes.
But I think this is part of Sorkinization. Part of the Sorkin idea is that first of all, we learn that our opponents are not completely bad, and we learn that we ourselves are perhaps not as good as we thought. So Dave Dellinger, man of peace, discovers he has anger. He can be violent too. And this is part of the process of coming to terms with ourselves and our enemies that leads to this harmonious conclusion where our values come to triumph over our differences. Now, it does seem to me, having been through the last 4 years, I'm not so sure that Sorkinization works anymore.
Yes. Well, I mean, to get back to the original question, you know, that Bert asked about, you know, about giving up on America. And Thomas said, "Did you give up too soon?" You know, and I think for some people, like watching last week, like, did we give up too late? You know, had we not realized how bad in so many ways that things were in the country, because somehow maybe people of our age thought we'd taken care of some of this stuff, and then realized that some of the people who I thought of as outliers, talking about certain things, realized, oh, they're actually more accurate in describing Donald Trump and the people who vote for him than I ever thought they were, because there's a little bit of Sorkin in me. You know, maybe it's because I'm a nice Midwestern boy, like you, John. We're both nice Midwestern boys who think of sensible Midwesterners, not actually just like voting a race ticket. Yet they might vote, you know, to realize they do vote a race ticket is an interesting and horrifying thing.
Can you introduce us, John W., to the cast of characters, and in particular, a not nice Midwesterner, this nasty piece of work, who was the presiding federal judge, whose view of the case was summarily rejected by the Seventh Circuit on appeal. But let us know who were the Chicago 8, then 7, and who presided over this trial. Some of us, as I looked at the gallery view here, perhaps don't exactly remember it, either for one reason or another. I won't speculate.
Okay, so we have the judge, Julius Hoffman, who makes a big point in the movie and in the real trial of pointing out that although he has the same name as one of the defendants, Abbey Hoffman, they are not related. And of course, Abbey at that moment shouts out, "Father, how could you?"
Yes.
Rennie Davis and Tom Hayden and Dave Dellinger represent the sort of hardcore political organizers. Jerry Rubin and Abbey Hoffman are the yippie cultural revolutionary, revolution for the hell of it people. Bobby Seale is brought in for no particularly good reason. He's a scary Black Panther, but really had nothing to do with the so-called conspiracy. And the attorneys are the memorable William Kunstler and Leonard Wineglass. And then there's also the prosecutors, Thomas Foran and who is it that's
Richard Schultz.
And Richard Schultz, played beautifully by Joseph
Yes.
Gordon-Levitt.
Yes, I mean beautifully, but inaccurately, because he was a bulldog rather than a Sorkin invented nice guy prosecutor who kind of was reluctant to do this.
Yes, this is true. I want to go back to the Tom Hayden accuracy question just for a minute, because so let us posit that this film is totally unfair to Tom Hayden. It misrepresents his politics completely by making him into this sort of moderate liberal fellow who got a haircut for the trial. That's not true. Who kind of dresses respectfully. That's not really true. But let's just look at it as the character Tom Hayden. Here's a guy who is very sincerely, he argues with Abbey, this is not a political trial. You know, this is a trial about the charges against us. But through the course of the trial, he learns in the Sorkin way to change his mind about this. So he comes to realize it is a political trial. The judge is terribly unjust. The system is unjust. The war is wrong. And so the happy ending is he takes his stand. Now, that's the character Tom Hayden. I think Sorkin is onto something when he takes an ordinary guy who believes in the system, who then becomes radicalized in 1968 and 69. And the message is, you don't have to, I mean, to us is, you don't have to be the real Tom Hayden. The real Tom Hayden didn't need to learn to resist authority from Julius Hoffman, but the character Tom Hayden has a character arc that leads him to this realization, which Sorkin hopes that the audience will join in on. Isn't that really what's going on here?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think the tricky part of it, of course, is that there was an actual existing Tom Hayden.
Yes.
And that probably most of America, I mean, although I'm sure your book will actually be the most important thing, but the second most important thing that for Americans knowing about this trial will be watching this Netflix series. And their sense of the Netflix series will lead them to think that Tom Hayden was that particular kind of person, and that maybe you could have done a fictional version of something in a similar kind of way. I mean, to get back to our good friend Atticus Finch, you know, I mean, you could teach people through fictional characters rather than actually using real live things. I mean, one sees the temptation, but I mean that's the objection to it, is that it's not true.
But here's the thing. The most boring thing a historian can say about a movie is it's not accurate. The question about, especially this kind of movie, this is not a documentary. This is an Aaron Sorkin drama. The question is not, is it accurate? The question is it any good? Now, I'm the historian. I'm here to say it's not accurate, but you're here as the film critic. So we are lucky to be able to ask you, in your professional capacity, is this film any good?
It's very watchable. You know, I mean, I could go through each of the characters, you know, that it's too schematic, probably too talky. There's, you know, to do it, there probably should be more of the actual violence of Chicago. I mean, I think back of the film Medium Cool, which was made around the time by Haskell Wexler, which I didn't think was a very good film, but it certainly had an astonishing footage from there. And so I think that it's part of the muted quality of the film that nobody's ever quite as radical as they actually were. So and so at that sense, it's a little blander as a film than I would like to see, given all the stuff that was happening. I mean, I mean, I guess that would be my objection to it. Is it's a perfectly presentable thing. It almost seems fitting that it's on television rather than in a movie theater. So, in that respect,
there's one part of it that's not bland, of course, and that's Sacha Baron Cohen as Abbey.
okay.
I mean, people are saying Sacha Baron Cohen was born to play Abbey.
Yeah.
And when Steven Spielberg came up with the idea for this, he always wanted Sacha Baron Cohen to be Abbey. And and Sacha Baron Cohen had agreed to be Abbey from 2009 or whenever it was they first hatched this plan. In some ways, Abbey is kind of like the best possible version of the characters that Sacha Baron Cohen has come up with. You know, he's got a real serious core, and he changed history for real, not just being Borat that made us laugh. But in Sorkin world, the Abbey character, although he is the exciting person in this film,
Yes.
he has an arc too. And his arc, I think, I've been thinking about this, his arc is that he learns that some things, are not a joke. He learns to be serious. And the key moment there is when he's being quizzed at some press conference or something about, what's your price, Hoffman? What's your price? And he says, what's my price for the revolution? My life. And he's completely serious, and the camera is tight on him. And so he has learned, he has an arc too. His arc is learning that everything is not a joke, that there's a seriousness here.
Yes, and as a film critic, you could perhaps make the case that giving people arcs may be a limitation of a film rather than a strength of it. That somehow, because arcs are quite neat. So over the course of 2 hours and 20 minutes, two famous cultural radicals have been slightly squeezed into fitting a story that will be appealing and soothing, where they learn a lesson. But as I say, that's probably, Aaron Sorkin is an extremely good and skillful screenwriter.
Can I just ask about the arc of Bobby Seale and how that moves us to current political, racial, and social issues?
Yeah.
Because I do think in many respects that is the most timely and important character. And talk a little bit about that if you would.
So the most dramatic moments of the trial, and I think the most dramatic moments of the film, come when Bobby Seale, who has been denied the presence of his personal attorney, Charles Gary, who's just had his gallbladder removed in San Francisco, and they applied to have the trial postponed so Gary could participate, but Judge Hoffman denied the motion. He keeps protesting that he is not represented there. And eventually he comes to demand the right to represent himself. And for this, Judge Hoffman orders him bound and gagged. And there's the spectacle of a Black man in chains in a courtroom in America. Now, again, it's not completely accurate the way this is presented, because in real life, this went on for 4 days, where Bobby Seale would be trying to shout through his gag, and he'd be taken back and bound up even more tightly. Sorkin makes it into one scene, one horrifying scene. He condenses it, which I think is a prerogative of a writer and director. I found it very powerful, almost unbearable. I thought it was played very nicely by Yahya Abdul-Mateen II. I don't know his work, but he's quite accomplished.
He was in Watchmen. He was the kind of payoff hero of Watchmen.
And didn't you think he was a very convincing Black man demanding his rights?
Yeah, he was. I think the film, I think, does make it clear that he's. The thing that was true about him, and which I think resonates today, is that he was only in this trial because you could gin up the feelings of people by putting the scary Black men in the trial, and that would actually kind of send waves off to the other white people who will then seem more sinister because they're actually working with this guy, and somehow they are touched by that, and which was of course the reason why he was there, and yeah.
And yes, indeed, as Bert says, how amazing for Aaron Sorkin that this, after being on the books in trying to get this launched since 2009, should finally make it on TV at the end of the summer of Black Lives Matter, when the police violence against Black people it's the center of American life. Aaron Sorkin admits, he said, we lucked out. Suddenly our history, caught up with our movie and brought it back and made it relevant, which was, of course, not the way they conceived it in the last, 15 years he's been working on this.
Yeah, I mean, I had this peculiar thought, which I hope people will bear with me on. In watching it, I was struck that if you combined, say, the Yippies and Judge Hoffman, you would get something like Trump, which is to say that Hoffman has some of the Trump qualities, which is he's completely narcissistic. He doesn't listen to anybody. He's absolutely sure he's right. He demands complete fealty and control.
Judge Hoffman, not Abbey. Judge Hoffman.
Yeah, Judge Hoffman. But Abbey and the Yippies and the other people are basically saying that the forms that have to be overturned. The norms aren't true. The system isn't just. It's a fake trial. It's not really true. It's not really the trial that you think it is. And that kind of disruptive aspect of Yippies, gets wedded to the authoritarian side of Hoffman. And Trump is kind of in there because for his people, he's saying a lot of the kinds of things that Yippies were saying about the system and it all being a sham and how you're being led to do. I mean, all of this. So the anti-war rebellious part is wedded onto the truly horrific Judge Hoffman side. And as I said, it's a demented theory, but you can see those forces, because part of the thing about the right now is that it's the one that has the fun, crazy people. When I was growing up, the left had the fun, crazy people, and now it's all on the right, where it's basically to hell with responsibility. We will tweet on the things about QAnon because we don't care about that, and that's in some ways a similar spirit, I think, to like throwing dollar bills at the Wall Street. The reasons aren't the same, but the kind of shake it up spirit is the same.
I appreciate the radical vision that you have.
Thank
here.
you. That means you disagree completely, but I'm charmed by that.
It's a provocative thesis, and of course in the film, it's the assistant prosecutor Richard Schultz who finds the spectacle of the black man in chains to be intolerable as a prosecutor in front of the jury and asks for a mistrial. I don't think that's what happened in real life. And that takes us back to the Richard Schultz character and Joseph Gordon-Levitt playing him as a man full of doubts. He knows that there really wasn't a conspiracy. He tells Attorney General John Mitchell in the early scene that they've concluded that the police started the riot, not the kids. And but Mitchell says, you're getting the biggest assignment of your life. Your career depends on this. Aren't you going to go do it? And he has doubts, but he goes and does it. So as you say, the real Richard Schultz, he's still around, and he is bitter as hell he's mad as hell. He's more angry than the children of Dave Dellinger about the inaccuracies in this. He says he never had any doubts about the legitimacy of this trial. He always believed the defendants were guilty. He's completely misrepresented in this. He's mad as hell about it. And indeed, one of the themes of the Sorkin movie is don't be a prosecutor. What do prosecutors do? Bert, this is, you were a prosecutor. I'm sure you picked this up. The message is, this prosecutor has doubts about the legitimacy of this trial. He knows it's really an unfair prosecution, but for careerist reasons, because he wants to get promoted in the Justice Department of Richard Nixon, he suppresses his doubts and sense of justice for careerism. And Aaron Sorkin says, don't be like Richard Schultz. If you have doubts, you need to act on your sense of justice and right and not do the careerist thing. Bert, what was your experience as a federal prosecutor?
I was going to say, allow me a point of personal privilege, and then I have a question. The point of personal privilege is that each of the prosecutors in my world, including those in my immediate family, subscribe to the view that the best possible way for decent, honorable people to ensure justice was to become a prosecutor, because you have this enormous power and discretion, and properly exercised, you can make the system work. Which leads me into my question to you, which is, what is the bigger learning from this Chicago 7, Chicago 8 trial? Does it really matter? And if it does matter, how does it fit in with what we're experiencing today?
Well, the strategy of the defense was to put the system on trial, to expose the injustice of the so-called justice system, and to, confront, to speak truth to power. And in a lot of ways, in real life, they lucked out by getting Judge Julius Hoffman, because there's never been a judge as arbitrary, as capricious, as unjust, and as intolerable as he was, as Bert, as you say, the appellate court found in its evaluation of his, in reversing the convictions and vacating about 90% of his contempt citations. So the trial was kind of confirmed the radical view of justice in America, and especially Nixon's America. And it is interesting that Aaron Sorkin wants to make the point, which is a true point, actually, that if Hubert Humphrey had been elected, this trial never would have been held. This was a Republican idea, even though the demonstrations were against the Democratic National Convention. The Democrats weren't going to prosecute this. It was the Republicans that wanted to do it. So they kind of played into the worldview of Tom and Rennie and Dave and Abbey and Jerry. And we didn't mention the other two, the two unknowns, John Freunds, who teaches at UCLA right now, and my near namesake, Lee Weiner, who's still a political activist in Florida. I talked to him last week. Their worldview was confirmed, and that was the work of Richard Nixon and John Mitchell, and of course Thomas Farran and Richard Schultz.
How did Consular and Wineglass do as lawyers, and how did they do in the movie? What was your assessment?
Well, let us talk, John Powers, about Mark Rylance, the glorious Sir Mark Rylance, honored as one of Britain's greatest Shakespearean actors. He played a famous lawyer in another TV movie. He was Thomas Cromwell in Wolf Hall. He's back, and he's still got that furrowed brow and scheming, always trying to anticipate what's going to come next and strategizing. John Powers, what did you think of Mark Rylance as the lead defense attorney here?
Well, he's more likable than Consular. The actual Consular should be grateful to have someone so sympathetic with such a lovely lilt to his voice and a twinkle to his eye, and who seems so wise, and all of those things. Wineglass scarcely figures in the film, but his Consular is like the dream of William as a man of justice and sanity and decency and wit. Don't you think? And because Rylance is a wonderful actor, in the same way that Julius Hoffman in the film is fantastic, because Frank Langella just does a great job playing him. I think the actual Julius Hoffman was so much worse but somehow you have a rotten film if he's much worse because it's just so grating you couldn't bear to watch it. Whereas when you have a good old actor hamming it up a little bit, but not but not as much as he could, then it's very entertaining.
The real Kunstler in the courtroom, he had been in many courtrooms, especially, I mean, he talked about it in the Deep South where the judges were, dyed in the wool racists, and he was representing freedom riders and sit-in activists. But I think he was actually kind of dumbfounded by Judge Hoffman. He'd never seen a judge act like this before, and it really kind of set him back. He didn't know what to do. There were a lot of funny things happened between the two of them. One of my favorites is, but we talked about this a little bit before we went live here. Abbey Hoffman insults Judge Julius Hoffman in Yiddish. And Judge Hoffman objects bitterly and says he's going to find him in contempt of court. And William Kunstler says, Your Honor, cannot the defendant address you in the Hebraic tongue? And Judge Hoffman says, I wouldn't call it that. So some of that is lost in the movie, but I think in real life, Kunstler did his best, but was overwhelmed by the circumstances. And yes, we're so lucky that Mark Rylance was willing to do this.
Yes, but I mean, and one of the things that's also lost, but that is in your book, are some of the wonderful things when people like Norman Mailer are called onto the stand. And, where in addition to everything else, Norman Mailer is doing such a great impression of Norman Mailer while testifying, because it's like he's out selling books while he's on the stand. And he's talking about himself in third person a little bit and having to explain how heroically he couldn't do some of the stuff because he was busy writing. And he's folding that into the testimony when it's completely unnecessary, and then you have Allen Ginsberg, explaining Ohm. I mean, like some of those things are so, that the kind of outsiders to the zoo-like nature of the trial and the fact that it lasted a really long time, a little bit of that is lost. When they're just dragging in famous person, and it all comes down to basically Ramsey Clark in the film.
Yeah, let's talk about Ramsey Clark for a minute. This was this is one of the things people ask me. Is that part true? Did the former Attorney General testify in the trial that the present Attorney General was bringing charges that they had already decided not to bring? Yes, that's exactly what happened. And Ramsey Clark, who was LBJ's Attorney General, is played wonderfully, kind of a surprise cameo by Michael Keaton, who I believe was the original Batman, wasn't he?
Oh, and many other things, yes, but yes.
I mean, as usual, Sorkin takes it a little too far. It's true. There's a scene where Tom and Kunstler go to the home of the former Attorney General to talk him into this. And he says, how come it took you guys so long to get here? Yeah. This didn't actually happen. The whole scene comes out of Tom's memoir. It's called Reunion. And of course, it wasn't that dramatic. They asked Ramsey Clark if he would testify. And he said, I'll testify, but I will tell the truth. That's all he said. He didn't say why did it take you guys so long to get here?
Yeah. No, I was going to say, one of the interesting things about it, I mean, that is, that you want to get back to the point you were making about how prosecuting them in a way was a stroke of luck because it made people feel that Nixon and his people were particularly awful and to show the system was an unjust system. And one wonders that even though that they would not have prosecuted the Chicago 7 or 8 if Humphrey had won, they might still have prosecuted the war, which is to say that somehow the Democrats get a little bit left off the hook in this particular film because they had been in power for a bunch of years. Johnson was lying. The FBI wasn't being nice to people in the Johnson administration. It wasn't as if suddenly there was a switch was flipped, and all of a sudden the police were harsh on demonstrators, or that they were suspicious of the SDS. I mean, that was going on all along. Nevertheless, it is true that there wouldn't have been a trial if Ramsey Clark had been there.
You know, I'm very interested in, Bert, what you were like a child when this happened, but you say it is a touchstone for federal prosecutors like yourself. Would you talk a little bit more about what this trial meant to you, and what it's like to see it in a movie now?
Yes, I can do both, but I don't want to take too much of your time and the folks who are watching, who I know will have questions. But what it was I thought, to those of us who chose to be prosecutors, a paradigm of government acting improperly, and a shanda, a shame for anybody to act in that fashion, and a judge who was imperious, arbitrary, and an embarrassment to the system. And then coupled with the overlay of an African-American man being bound and gagged for 4 days in an American courtroom, has a very propulsive effect on someone who's trying to think, I went to law school, what the hell do I want to do with my life that might matter? Atticus Finch has already taken Henry Fonda, pretty much occupies that field.
Gregory Peck.
I sure could be fair and just, coupled with the time that I did this, when you stood up in court and announced your presence on behalf of the United States of America, there was almost an Aaron Sorkin soaring music behind you as you got ready. But that's enough about me. I haven't written any books. I do have one question for you about the defense, which is hard for me to really understand given the excerpts in the book. Just about every bold-faced name available in the counterculture was called as witnesses. I wasn't quite sure how the defense, first of all, was going to cohere. Secondly, I think I'm correct, it didn't cohere because the guys were convicted, at least on the Anti-Riot Act claims. But most importantly, how do they reconcile Tom Hayden's point of view of I'd really like to not be convicted with the Hoffman, Jerry Rubin point of view, that this is all going to be a game, we're going to try the system, and have functionally one lawyer representing all those points of view, which in our world would be a conflict of interest and immediate reversal for ineffective assistance of counsel. So give me a little bit of a feel for the real defense and how they were able to keep all those balls in the air. And then we'll take some questions.
In practice, the Jerry and Abbey notion of the defense to ridicule and disrupt the courtroom in an effort to delegitimize the system, they actually did almost none of that. There was a law professor did a study of the contempt citations, of which there were, hundreds. Judge Hoffman was very interested in documenting every single act of contempt, including, Abbey Hoffman blowing a kiss to the jury when he was introduced as a defendant. In practice, almost all of the disruption, often led by Abbey and Jerry and Dave Dellinger, occurred around truly outrageous acts by the judge, especially around Bobby Seale. I think something like half of all the contempt citations were them protesting, leaping to their feet, yelling at the judge, fighting with the marshals about the treatment of Bobby Seale. And this trial went on for 4.5 months. There were whole months where there was no yippee antics in the courtroom at all. The movie does portray very nicely the scene where Abbey and Jerry come in wearing judicial robes to mock the judge. That occurred at the very end when they were about to be sentenced, and they were making their statement there. But in practice, there was almost no disruption So this theory of the challenging the legitimacy of the system really was something that they articulated outside the courtroom, and they didn't practice. They practiced hardly at all in the courtroom, and I assume that's because Bill Kunstler and Len Weinglass told them, you know, we're running this trial, and let us we'll handle this. I'm not sure that's a fact, but that's my guess about what happened.
Okay. Teresa, do we have some questions, or how do you want to handle questions?
Sure. So everyone, there's two ways to ask questions tonight. The first is you can drop a question in the chat box and we will read it out loud for you. Secondly, if you know how, you can raise your hand on Zoom, in which case you can call out your name, unmute you, and you can ask your question yourself. So if you do have any, drop the line in the chat box or raise your hand. I'd like to use my privilege as fellow host to ask the first question, which is, I am no legal expert by any means, but watching the movie, one of the soaring themes seems to be, how does one control public opinion in a court of law, and how that affects both players on both sides. And so curious if you could talk a little bit about that, and especially if the trial happened nowadays, would that public scrutiny be even more influential on the case itself?
Well, the trial was huge news at the time. When it started, it was front page news. When it ended, it was front page news. Of course, it went in the 4.5 months. There was long periods when it wasn't big news. But one of the key features was that the defendants, every night after trial, went out, held press conferences, gave speeches, had often very big audiences in the thousands of people, raised money for the defense, made their case. So they were constantly trying to get media attention for their perspective. The movie actually conveys some of this. It shows especially Abbey's stand-up routines on college campuses in the Chicago area. There he ridiculed the process. And of course, the most important thing to the defendants, well, the most important thing, at least for the Tom Hayden faction, was to win a couple, at least one, maybe two jurors to their side so that there would be a hung jury and they wouldn't be convicted. So there was a lot of talk about the war is the real issue. What's really happening in Vietnam is why we were there. The prosecution, of course, had to deny that. In fact, Schultz said, the war in Vietnam has nothing to do with this trial, Your Honor. And the judge said sustained,
Yes.
which he actually said to everything that Richard Schultz and Thomas Ferren said. But that one, I think everybody in America knew that the trial was about the demonstrations and the demonstrations were about the war. So it was not that hard for the defendants to connect the dots.
It's completely accurate. I couldn't say it better, John.
We have a question in the chat room that I'm not too familiar with, but it's from James Wilberforce. He's asking to tell the story about Bill and the weed that got sent to the defense care of the court. Does that ring a bell?
Why don't we get him on screen and have him tell it? I'm not sure that I haven't mastered this part of it. I know what he's talking about, but I'm not qualified to explain it.
Yes.
Got it. We do have a raised hand actually from Brad Bryan. So Brad, I'm gonna go ahead. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question if you'd like.
So I was saying the other day that 1968 was arguably the most tumultuous year in American history since 1861, and that's passing through 2 world wars. But you know, at the time, we all thought the divide in the country will never be healed. It's just sort of so many different divides. We did seem to get past it. I Googled some of the participants after watching the movie the other night. Jerry Rubin became a stockbroker, an early investor in Apple, was actually killed when he was crossing Wilshire Boulevard to go into his luxury apartment on Wilshire. And I guess my question, and maybe goes beyond the book and the movie, Are we at a state of divide in this country now that is qualitatively different than even in 1968? And how do you compare the two?
Well, it's a great question. And it's, of course, very much on our minds this week. What happened after 1968, there was a tremendous divide about the war, and Nixon did get elected, and that did make it seem hopeless. And then what nobody anticipated in 68 or 69 was that Nixon would face an impeachment trial in the Senate and would be forced to resign. And that the war in Vietnam would be ended, and that a Democrat would then be elected, Jimmy Carter. So that's part of what I call the you never know history of theory of history. You never know what's going to happen. I mean, right now, it does seem like the Sorkin vision of, well, we'll all, through a process of debate, we'll all come to understand each other's positions and American values will triumph. That doesn't seem very convincing at this point in American history. And it does seem like that the Trump supporters, at least the bedrock Trump supporters, are going to be intransigent when the Biden wins, as all the polls suggest he will, and that the current battles will continue through the Biden, the Biden era, and we're not going to have any let up, and it's going to be, a continuing battle. But then there's also the you never know factor. We don't really know what's going to happen. After, I'm assuming that on January 20th, Joe Biden will take the oath of office and there'll be a Democratic majority in the Senate, and then there'll be an intransigent Trump base of, whatever it is, 33% of Americans who support him, not just because of his tax cuts, but because they believe in him. And I think that, my view, for what it's worth, is that they're going to be with us for a long time, but you never know.
Yeah, I would say, having lived through, as I think several of us here have lived through that year, the division is much more intense now. For a great number of reasons. One of them is that the country isn't as rich and powerful as it was. So there's less to go around, and people feel that. Part of it is that there's been a breakdown of the kind of authority that existed, that whether you liked it or not in 1968. I think that people didn't have separate newspapers that were covering the trial and claiming that the other coverage of the trial was just not true. Okay, and you didn't have the way in which everything seems to be fed instantly on social media, so you can fuel all of that. And all of that seems to me crazy. Also, there are just more crazy people carrying guns into public places in a way that didn't exist before. And all of which makes it more extreme now. And it seems to me harder to heal. But maybe I'm wrong.
But let me say, there's one tremendous difference, especially if we look at 1972. In 1972, finally, we got an anti-war candidate to run as the Democrat. And George McGovern carried only Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. Nixon won 49 states.
Yeah.
And he won by 34 million votes. Hillary Clinton actually won the popular vote. You may have heard about this. She won by almost 3 million votes. So at the end of the 60s, we were a much smaller political minority. Today, there's no question that we are in the majority, and we're dealing with an intransigent and indeed armed minority, and we're not quite sure how far they're going to take this. But it's a big difference from 1972. Trump has never had majority, has never approached even having 50% approval rating. Nixon was way up, much more popular than Trump, and we know what happened to him.
Yeah.
Can I ask John Powers a question that I'm sure everyone else wants to know the answer to? What is your backdrop?
Oh, my backdrop is a film called Memories of Murder, made by the film director Bong Joon-ho, who made Parasite. And it is a serial killer movie, very similar. You saw the film Zodiac. It is the South Korean version of Zodiac, though made before Zodiac, and much better than Zodiac, in part because it is a portrait of South Korea at a point in history when it was dictatorial. So that, you know, one of the interesting things just in passing in that film is that there's a serial killer killing people in this small city. And they need more police, but there aren't police because the police are all busy beating up demonstrators. So the government won't let extra cops come to the area for that political reason. But in fact, it's a really good film. And I put it there also because I just like it. I like it.
So you come to a Chevalier's event, and not only do you get Abbey Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, but you get Korean serial killers. Really, what more can you ask? Let's have a last question so people can go on with the rest of their Friday night. Teresa, is there one in the chat?
Sure. So there's one more from Dan Einstein. Question is, would you say that one of the differences between
I can
now
also
and then,
tell the weed story really quickly at some point.
Okay. James, we'll give you the chance after the question.
All right, thank you, James. Just a second. So the question is, would you say that one of the differences between now and then is the proliferation of guns, the rise of militias, and the rise of social media?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, partly because even, Abbey Hoffman would have been good on social media. That I think a lot of the things they did would have been just different events, because actually getting mass bodies in places is a different thing now than it used to be. So that would have changed things, but it also would have been different if you'd done that and say people on the right turned up carrying assault weapons. That would have been an entirely different thing than you had in 1968, which was comparatively benevolent, which is to say staggeringly brutal but benevolent compared to civilians with assault weapons, maybe thinking they need to keep order and just gunning people down, which is quite possible now, I think.
We should
Okay,
you want to let James tell his anecdote about weed in the courtroom?
Sure.
James?
James, if you could give us a brief summary of that story.
So thanks. This has been great. Thanks, everybody. This really spectacular discussion. Very enlivening. First, a very quick story about Abbey. I went to his funeral. He was from Worcester, Mass. I'm actually in a 7-Eleven in Cambridge. And so Abbey was from Worcester. And while he was underground later, some years after the Chicago trial, he would go back and visit a favorite restaurant in Worcester called El Morocco, kind of place that had sort of second-tier celebrity photographs up on the walls. And they had a photograph of Abbey signed, El Morocco, a great place to eat when you're on the run, Abbey Hoffman. So the story about Bill Kunstler, who was a magnificent person for anyone who didn't have the pleasure of meeting him or knowing him. He's told the story, I think, many times when he talked about the trial of someone having sent marijuana to the defendant's care of the courthouse. So I guess it might have been Judge Hoffman or a court officer saying to the defendants, there's a package here for you, but it has marijuana in it. And so Bill Kunstler gets up and says, Your Honor, and the judge Hoffman wants to know what they're going to do with it, and Kunstler gets up and says, "Judge, it will be burned tonight." Anyway, thanks.
What a perfect way to end an evening. So let me also add to both Johns how very much I enjoyed this evening and how grateful we at Chevalier's are for your taking the time to talk with us about this timely, interesting, fun topic. I hope those of you who are participating here will consider buying this really interesting, fun book and a nice visit back to the American system of justice in 1968 Conspiracy in the Streets, the extraordinary trial of the Chicago Seven. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, thank you, everyone. Have a great Friday evening. Thank you.